What's up, legends, and welcome back to another Meta Monday. Remember, not every Monday is meta, but only Mondays can be. Or at least that's the lie I tell myself to be able to fall asleep at night, considering that last week's Meta Monday was on a Tuesday, but let's just forget that ever happened. Today's video is about Yennenga, specifically how good she is, because this is a little bit of a complicated conversation, and especially with the conclusion of the Winter of Champions tournament, I feel like now is as good of a time as ever to talk about it. And in case you didn't see the conclusion of that tournament, the semifinals and finals were streamed this past weekend, and I actually was the host for a few of those streams, so I would definitely go check out the VOD on Twitch, and it should be uploaded to the Unmatched Tournament YouTube channel probably in the next week or two, and I will link to both of those channels on YouTube and Twitch in the description if you want to go check it out and see my handsome mug in action. And I guess one more thing before we get started, I just want to, reassure some of my viewers that I'm kind of going to be returning to more regular content now that the tournament is over. I still have to get some of my matches up because I'm falling behind on that, and I actually have the Bloody Mary and Yennenga strategy guides ready to go. I just need to make them. So those should be up in the next 2 weeks, I think, and I will also be doing my first impressions video for the Hell's Kitchen characters after I finally get to play them this week, because I've been hesitant about diving into those. I just wanted to wait until the tournament was over. So anyways, that's just a little bit of a brief update ramble about the content that will be coming to you guys shortly. The question asked today is, how good is Yennenga? So I guess if we take a step back, we need to ask another question first. Is Yennenga good? And this is a pretty easy answer. Yes, she is good. So we're going to explore maybe why Yennenga is good today, and that will let us know how good she is at the end. So let's talk about some of Yennenga's deck strengths. For one, she has just excellent fundamentals. She is ranged. Her sidekicks, the archers, are ranged. She has a ton of versatiles in her deck. I think she has 20 versatiles and 16 are specifically for Yennenga. So that's just a ton of options for both attacking and defending depending on the game state. And she has a very solid deck composition. As I talked about in my consistency video, she has 12 unique cards, which is a relatively low number, and that's good. And she has a lot of 2 and 3 copy cards, which means that her draws will be relatively consistent. She can use most of her cards multiple times, which lets her perform similar actions or combos repeatedly throughout the game, and a lot of her cards are very good, so being able to play them repeatedly is awesome. If you want more information on consistency, I would definitely go check out that video, and I explore deck composition in greater depth. It's a really interesting concept to me, so yeah, go check that one out. Another thing Yennenga does really well is she has insane damage mitigation. Most of her cards are either around 3 value. She has some 2s and some 4s, but 3 value cards are kind of her bread and butter, which doesn't sound super great for most characters, because we've seen like Bruce Lee has a lot of 3 value block cards, and he dies pretty quickly to some big values. But Yennenga has her archers, and her ability lets her kind of spread damage out from her to her archers if they're in the same zone as her. So that effectively kind of increases the value of her block cards in a way, because she won't be taking the extra damage. She'll be dealing it to her sidekicks. And 3 value block cards are decent when you have a little bit more damage mitigation on the side. And Yennenga also has healing. So I think damaging Yennenga is something that a lot of characters will have trouble with, because you need to kill the archers first, and then you have to burst her down while she's vulnerable, which is no easy task. Yennenga also has Stallion Charge, which lets her move through opposing fighters up to 5 spaces after combat, and then she deals 1 damage to each opposing fighter she moved through, which effectively lets her shut down characters with multiple 1 health sidekicks, like Robin Hood, Dracula, Medusa, InGen, Electra, and I almost said Muldoon, but that's InGen. I'm pretty sure there's one more, but I can't remember right now. But anyways, all of those heroes besides Medusa I think just get deleted by this card. Medusa has some other stuff going on that makes the Yennenga matchup a little bit more interesting, but Stallion Charge is just a really good card for characters with multiple sidekicks, and it really gives Yennenga an edge in those matchups. Yennenga also has decent damage. Jaws of the Beast, Point Blank, and Momentous Shift, in addition to Stallion Charge, just provide constant chip damage, either dealing 1 damage or 2 damage with after combat effects, or just being relatively big values. And as we'll talk about next, Yennenga really likes having big combo turn finishers, so having all these cards that can constantly chip away at the opponent's health total is really good for setting up those big lethal combo turns. And speaking of which, she has Master of the Hunt to give her multiple actions. She has Rain of Arrows, which is a really solid double attack, or bonus attack, I should say. And things like Surprise Volley, being able to gain actions. She can unleash so many attacks per turn. Probably, like, she's up there with Bruce Lee and the Raptors at being able to combo people to death. And a lot of times her win condition will just be, I'm going to throw a bunch of 3s at you, and if you can't block them all, you're going to die. So just all of these things together make Yennenga really, really good because of her fundamentals, her damage mitigation, the existence of specific cards like Stallion Charge, Master of the Hunt, Surprise Volley, and Rain of Arrows, and just decent damage on top of those big combo pieces. So let's talk about Yennenga's matchup into the previous meta. I know with the Marvel sets coming out and Jurassic Park 2 and even more Marvel sets later this year, the previous meta is definitely a thing of the past, but the remnants of it are still in place. So while this discussion, I guess, is a little outdated even now, it's just important to kind of like time stamp Yennenga's impact on what was a very concrete meta about 4 or 5 months ago. So into Bigfoot, Yennenga actually has a 60% win rate over 53 plays so far on League. All of this data is to date, so probably in a week it'll be slightly outdated, but just at the time of recording, that's what it is. And like having a 55 to 45% win rate in a matchup means it's relatively even. But when you get to like 60 and up, that means generally if the Yennenga player is about as skilled or more skilled than the Bigfoot player, and they get relatively lucky, I guess, it should be a decisive victory most of the time. So 60% of the time Yennenga can win that, which against a member of the big 3 is just a great win rate to have. I think the key for Yennenga in this matchup is the insane damage mitigation she has against Bigfoot. Bigfoot has a lot of high value attacks like Savagery, Momentous Shift, and Larger Than Life, of course. So Yennenga being able to kind of spread out that damage, not on her hero solely, I think is really good, and that can give Bigfoot a little bit of trouble. There are some things going for Bigfoot in that matchup, like his movement effects, Jackalope Horns being really good to just delete archers, and having 5 cancels that can help slow down combo turns for Yennenga. But I think as something we talked about in the Bigfoot versus Battle of Legends Volume 2 Meta Monday video a month or 2 ago, I think that matchup is generally Yennenga favored. Medusa. Yennenga has a 48% win rate into Medusa over 88 plays currently, and this is, I guess, not as dominant for Yennenga as some of her other matchups into these other elite characters, but having a 50-50 matchup with one of the best characters in the game is a lot better than most other heroes can ask for. So even though this is generally, I don't want to say coin flippy, but it's a very skill-based matchup. The win rate is about 50, meaning that each character wins half the time, obviously. So going into this, if you think you are more skilled than your opponent, whatever side you are on, you should come out on top. If your opponent doesn't get super lucky and you have like decent draws, you can use your skill to maybe come out on top more often than not. Stallion Charge, like I mentioned earlier, is really good at killing all the harpies, but Medusa is still really good without her sidekicks and the 3 discards that come with the clutching claws for the harpies. And lots of versatiles means that Yennenga can generally defend a lot and shouldn't have to take an undefended Gaze of Stone, although that is probably Medusa's win condition unless she can deal a bunch of damage to Yennenga with second shot boosted with 4 value boost. Sherlock Holmes, Yennenga, I think, dominates Sherlock because neither of these characters have a lot of draw, and so that means that Yennenga can burst down Sherlock a little bit more consistently than other characters because he only has 15 block cards in his deck that Sherlock can use. So Yennenga, I think, just has to chip away at his defenses, set up a big combo turn, and then go to town. Confirm Suspicion, which is normally a really good card for Sherlock, doesn't really work on Yennenga because she can just deal the damage to the archers and not her heroes, which means that in order for Sherlock to effectively use that card in the matchup, he has to kill the archers first, meaning he has to go a little bit aggressive, which is very hard for him, and Yennenga can punish him. So Yennenga wins this 68% of the time, which is a very, very solid win rate. Although there aren't a lot of plays, only 19, which generally means it's a smaller sample size than Medusa, who has almost 90 plays against Yennenga. And InGen or Muldoon, there really isn't enough data for this matchup, so I'm not going to even put anything on screen because there were like less than 10 plays of this matchup on UM League, and that's not a reputable stat, I should say. But I have played this matchup before a few times, and it's bad for Muldoon. Stallion Charge absolutely wrecks the workers, and even though he can bring them all back with 2 call for backups, InGen's goal is to use his workers to have his hero avoid taking attacks because he really only has 5 fours to block with and 3 feints, and a lot of times other heroes just need to attack him more than 5 times and they'll generally win because he just can't take that much damage. He's very squishy, and Yennenga being double ranged kind of cancels out InGen being double ranged, and the combo turns will just wreck Muldoon because he won't be able to block with quality blocks for very long. So I think this is very, very Yennenga favored, probably even more than Yennenga into Sherlock Holmes. Other notable mentions, Yennenga is also good into Dracula, Sun Wukong, and Robin Hood, and I think Dracula and Robin especially are seeing a little bit less plays in Winter of Champions than they were in Summer of Legends, but they were pretty popular picks, and I think it's just good to point out that Yennenga is also good into them. But Yennenga matches up very well into the big 3 and Muldoon, who are the top 4 heroes in the previous big tournament, and her worst matchup is a 50-50, which against a member of the big 3 is pretty much one of the best things you can ask for, considering that most heroes in the game could not even dream of having almost a 70% win rate against Sherlock Holmes. Let's talk about some things that Yennenga is bad at now, because every hero in this game has strengths and weaknesses, and that's how the decks are balanced. There's no deck that can kind of do everything. Every deck is bad at something, and that's just the fun part of the game, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of certain characters. So Yennenga has no card draw in her kit. She does have One with the Land, which is a scheme that heals all of her fighters 1, lets her move all of her fighters up 2 spaces, and draws a card. So it's essentially a maneuver. The reason why I don't count that as card draw is because you're not drawing more cards from doing that action than you would be if you just maneuvered. So you don't really have good ways of drawing lots of cards at once, like with Riches Beyond Compare or something like that, and you can't really gain hand advantage quickly over your opponent because basically the best thing you can do is double maneuver on your turn to draw 2 more cards. She also has trouble digging through her deck to find cards because if she has a bad draw, she doesn't really have any easy way to get out of that situation. She can just draw 2 cards per turn and just hope to find something. So characters that can aggress her or can draw lots of cards while continuing to pressure her can do decently well into her. She also doesn't have any cancels. She has no feints or anything like that. So all enemy effects are always going to trigger against Yennenga, which some heroes, when they know that their effect isn't going to get canceled, they can play much differently than when they have to play around feints. So you'll see most of her bad matchups rely on their effects always triggering to gain an upper hand. So speaking of her bad matchups, let's talk about her counters. And I say that a little bit I'm putting up air quotes here, as I'll explain in a second. Sinbad is probably Yennenga's worst matchup. So far on UM League, Yennenga wins 10% of the time into Sinbad over 63 plays. Now, I mentioned how a 45% to a 55% win rate is like relatively even. Anything over 60 is generally favorable. Sinbad wins 90% of the time, which is just insane. I think this is one of the most one-sided matchups in the entire game, and that's because Sinbad is really good at exploiting both of Yennenga's weaknesses. He has an insane amount of card draw, and his voyages all have really good effects that you generally want to cancel against Sinbad, and they turn into huge attacks as the game goes later. His heal voyage, his damage voyage, his random discard voyage, and voyage home will all be guaranteed to trigger because Yennenga has no feints, so Sinbad can play his voyages basically with no fear that the effect won't go through, and the damage will overpower Yennenga even with her mitigation. The fact that he and his sidekick the Porter will be able to move upwards of 4 or 5 spaces very quickly into the game also helps mitigate Yennenga's range. So I think there's just so much going for Sinbad in this matchup. It makes sense why he absolutely dominates Yennenga. Yennenga's next worst matchup is Bloody Mary. Yennenga wins 41% of the time, which means Bloody Mary wins 59% of the time. So that's still like not super favorable. It's definitely not the same as Sinbad, but Bloody Mary is generally favorable because Mary, like Sinbad, has excellent effects on jump scare and her third action attacks and her double attack that, when not canceled and when Mary knows they're not going to be canceled, are a lot more potent and easier to play. Mary also has decent card draw with Closer Than She Appears, Broken Glass, and Evade. And just Yennenga will normally overpower her opponents with a lot of relatively low value attacks, like a lot of threes. And that value, Mary is really good at dealing with. She has trouble versus characters that can hit her for high value attacks, especially using effects to boost those values up. But against Yennenga, I think the value spread of Mary's cards is very good. And Yennenga's next worst matchup is Little Red Riding Hood, who wins 57% of the time. Or I should say, Yennenga has a 43% win rate into Little Red. So a little bit better for Yennenga compared to Bloody Mary, but still decently favored for Red, considering that every single one of her cards has a good effect, especially Stones in the Belly, Once Upon a Time, Long Have I Sought You. So things like that Red knows aren't going to get canceled, she can play a lot safer. Although her basket is still subject to, I guess, Yennenga has some tricks to mess up Little Red's effects, because things like Surprise Volley and Shield Formation can kind of mess up the basket, especially with some of those discards, Pin the Prey too. And so I think Little Red isn't totally in the clear with her effects, considering that there's something else affecting whether or not the effect will go through besides just the card due to the symbols in the basket. Little Red also has decent card draw with the Wolf Skin and I guess Never Leave the Path, but Never Leave the Path is best used as area of effect damage, or AoE, because she can clear out the archers with the 2 damage from the dagger effect on Never Leave the Path, and then also deal 2 damage to Yennenga. So Little Red going first on Sarpedon, if she's able to do the thing, I think her win rate is definitely a lot higher than the 57% just normally. But again, Little Red won't always have map and position pick, and that's when the matchup can get a little bit more in Yennenga's favor. So I say counters in air quotes because I think Sinbad is definitely a hard counter, one of the hardest counters in the game to Yennenga. But Bloody Mary and Little Red having almost 60% win rates, but it's like sub 60 win rates, that's not even a counter. That's just a little bit better than being a close matchup. So yes, you could say Little Red and Bloody Mary counter Yennenga, but they are definitely not hard counters. It's definitely still very even matchups, and I think skilled Yennengas, especially players like Zero Skater 12, who I think Yennenga is his new main, and he's shown this tournament that he can win almost any single matchup with Yennenga. They're not counters. Skilled Yennengas can come out on top. And I've actually beaten Bloody Mary with Yennenga a couple times in tournament situations. Humble brag. But let's talk about what this impact has on the meta, because Yennenga will beat the previous top picks, or the big three, or big four, whatever you want to call them, from last summer. I think the big three kind of doesn't exist right now, but that's a topic for a different video. And Yennenga has some counters that are definitely a little bit low tier. Little Red and Sinbad are maybe high tier, but Bloody Mary is definitely middle of the pack at best. And the previous top picks, the previous big three, big four, I think should beat the counters for Yennenga more often than not. I think Little Red actually poses the big four a lot of problems, but in general, I think most of those heroes from the big three should beat Sinbad pretty consistently. So you kind of have this like rock, paper, scissors triangle meta where Yennenga beats the previous top picks, and the previous top picks beat Yennenga's counters, and the Yennenga counters obviously beat Yennenga. So looking at this from the lens of the conquest format, if you pick Yennenga, you're kind of forcing your opponent into a weird situation where they either have to ban Yennenga to avoid playing against her, or they just go all in and try to counter Yennenga. And maybe they have, if you're leader, a common draft would be Sherlock, Medusa, Yennenga, Sinbad. You might pick like Bigfoot or something, and your opponent will pick Bloody Mary or Little Red, and they'll have Medusa, Sinbad, and Bloody Mary to go against your Yennenga. And still, that's not even super great for them, because they had to sacrifice one of their picks for a matchup that's like relatively even into Yennenga with Little Red and Bloody Mary. And with your third pick, like if you pick Bigfoot or something, you should beat them with that matchup. And Yennenga into Medusa is still a relatively even skill matchup. That's a 50-50 at best, I think, for both sides. So if the leader with Yennenga just bans Sinbad, the follower isn't even in that great of a position. So I think what makes Yennenga so good is that in the current tournament format, she kind of forces your opponent, if you have her, she forces the player without Yennenga to kind of either make suboptimal drafting decisions in the grand scheme of like overall hero strength on their side, or ban Yennenga, which leaves probably another member of the big three open who's harder to just directly counter, like Sherlock or Medusa. So especially in a draft format like this, Yennenga poses a lot of problems. But looking at just her general matchup spread without the conquest format involved at all, she has a horrible matchup into Sinbad. Horrible. I don't want to say unwinnable, because 10% of the time is still 10%. It's just I would not rely on being able to get an upset there with Yennenga at all. I've played the Sinbad side of that matchup a number of times and feel very, very bad for Yennenga in that matchup. She has some questionable matchups into Bloody Mary and Little Red that are soft counters at best. And then maybe she loses to someone like the Raptors, because the not having cancels means that the Raptors' action gain will always go through, the ambushes will always go through, things like that. But Yennenga should be able to combo out the Raptors pretty consistently, because they only have 10 block cards. So I guess if we're just looking at matchup spread and asking the question that I posed at the beginning, how good is Yennenga? She has one bad matchup, 3 iffy matchups into Medusa, Bloody Mary, and Little Red. And I think the rest of the roster she can very handedly beat. So if we're asking how good is Yennenga, my answer is the best. So that's just my take on Yennenga's position in the current meta, and I definitely still see arguments for Medusa and Sherlock being the best heroes in the game, but they beat everyone else in the roster right now, and Medusa beats them. So that's just my logic for thinking that Yennenga is officially the big one, in my opinion. If we're just looking at the tournament data from Winter of Champions, I think it is a little misleading, just because Yennenga has a 52% win rate, which doesn't really sound that bad, but she was the most played hero with 222 plays, and her second most played matchup was Sinbad with 30 plays. Her most played matchup was Medusa with 31 plays. She loses in the Winter of Champions tournament. She lost that matchup 87% of the time. So that's 26 out of 30 games that were losses for her. So if we take out the Sinbad data from Yennenga's win rate, it actually gets bumped up to a 58% win rate without Sinbad, which seems a little bit more menacing. So I think the data is a little bit skewed there just because Yennenga was hard countered, or I should say targeted, a little bit more than maybe Medusa or Sherlock were in their win rates, but Medusa and Sherlock still have her beat in the win rate department. But I think that also is because we are looking at this in the context of the Conquest format, which allows heroes with counters to get punished more easily because of the way the pick ban works. But I still think that Yennenga is the best overall hero in the game right now, especially outside of the Conquest format where targeting things like that is less likely to happen. So that's just my take on this whole situation. If you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and just talk about Yennenga more, because I think she's a really interesting hero. She poses a lot of problems for a lot of heroes. So maybe if there's a counter that I'm missing, or you think a future upcoming hero will counter her, please let me know. I'd love to talk about that. I probably think it'll be a little bit easier for Yennenga to get countered by future heroes than Sherlock or Medusa, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. So that's really all I have for you guys today. Hopefully you're having a splendid Meta Monday. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, like, subscribe, and yeet!